Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 8 of SQL Server. In this session, we'll understand how to retrieve the last generated identity column value. In SQL Server, we can use scope underscore identity, identity, or ident underscore current functions to retrieve the last generated identity column value. In this session, we'll also talk about the differences between these three approaches of retrieving the identity column value. Now, if you haven't watched part 7 of this video series, I strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with this session. Now let's create two different tables. So let's say I have a table called create table test1. It's going to have an ID column which is of type integer, and I want this column to be identity column with seed s1 and increment s1. And I want a value column which is going to be nvarchar of 20. Okay, let's create another table and let's call it test2. Alright, let's create these two tables now. Execute the query, refresh the tables folder, and you should see both this test1 and test2. Now let's insert a record into test1 table. Insert into test1 values. And if you remember, in test1 ID column is an identity column, so we don't have to supply a value for that when we insert a record into this table. So just supply the value for name, the value column. Okay, so I'm going to pass x to this value column of test1 table. Now when we insert this record, what's going to happen? A record gets inserted into this test1 table. Now let's retrieve the data that's there. So select star from test1. So when you retrieve the row, this ID column is automatically generated by SQL Server and it got inserted into this table. Now let's say I want the last generated identity column to be retrieved. Okay, how can I do that? Basically, one way is to use scope identity function. Okay, there's a function called scope identity within SQL Server which we can use. So select scope identity. So when I press F5, look at that. The last generated identity column value is 1, so I get that. Let's insert this record again. Now there is another record inserted. If I press F5, look at that. The last generated identity column value is 2. Okay, so I have the scope identity function. Now it turns out that there is another global variable that we can use at identity. So there is another way to retrieve the last generated identity column value. So select at identity. When I execute this, let's execute both of them together. So when I execute both of them together, what's happening? They give us the same result. So then what's the difference between these two? Let's understand that with an example. Now the reason why we have created two tables, you'll understand that now. Okay, let me create a trigger on test1 table. Now we haven't spoken about triggers yet, which we'll be talking about in a later session in a great detail. But for now, understand that you can create a trigger on a table for a specific action. For example, let's say I have this test1 table. When I insert a row into this table, I want some processing to be done automatically. So is that possible? Yes, we can do that. How is it possible? Using triggers. So we can create a trigger on a table for a specific action. For example, whenever somebody inserts a row into test1 table, I want another row to be automatically inserted into test2 table by a trigger. Okay, so let's create a trigger on test1 table. So create trigger. Let's call this tr for insert on test1 table. For what action? For insert action, as begin end. So your trigger definition goes between this begin and end statements. Now if you look at this one, we are creating a trigger called tr for insert on test1 table for insert action. So whenever somebody inserts a row into test1 table, whatever you specify here will be executed. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to insert a row into test2 table. So insert into test2 values, and I'm going to say here maybe a value of y. Now if you remember, in test2 again we have an ID column and value column, and ID is an identity column. Okay, so let's create this trigger and execute this. Okay, so we have now test1 and test2 tables. And if you remember, on test1 table we have an insert trigger as well. So let's select and see what's the current state of the data. In test1 record we have two records. In test1 table we have two records. In test2 table we don't have any records. Now when I execute this insert statement, what's going to happen? This trigger is also going to get fired. So this trigger now will insert a record into test2 table. So now when we execute this insert query, there are two rows that are going to be inserted. One row into test1 table, another row by the trigger into test2 table. Okay, and then once we do that, let's take these two. Okay, let's insert the value first. So when I press F5, look at that, you get this message, one row affected twice. That's because one for this insert statement and one for the trigger itself. So now when we execute these two, look at the result. Okay, scope identity gave me number 3, whereas attach identity gave me number 1. Now let's execute. Okay, so 3 is from test1 table, 1 is from test2 table. Okay, so what's the difference between scope identity and attach identity? Now the similarity is both of them returns the last generated value. Now scope identity returns the last generated value in the same session. Session is nothing but a connection. So if you look at this, I just have one query editor window open which is connecting to the SQL Server. So I just have one session to the SQL Server. So in the same session and within the same scope. Okay, so if you look at this, I just have this insert statement. When I execute this, the scope is just this insert statement. So within this scope, okay, scope identity has returned a value which is 3. But whereas attach identity, when this statement got executed, there is a trigger defined on that table, and trigger inserted another row into another table, which in turn generated another identity column value. Okay, attach identity returned that value. Okay, so if you look at the presentation, scope identity returns the last generated identity value in the same session and in the same scope, whereas attach identity returns the last generated identity value in the same session but across any scope. Alright, now let's understand what do we mean by ident underscore current function. When do we actually use this, and what's the difference between this and the rest of these two. Now if you look at this ident underscore current function, basically if you look at the function name itself, it's expecting a table name parameter, meaning you pass the name of a table. So when you pass the name of a table there, it's going to give you the last generated identity column value for that table. Okay, but across any session and any scope. Okay, now session is nothing but a connection to the SQL Server, a new connection. Okay, so let's see. Now you can assume that this as one session. So let's say user 1 session is this one. Let's open another query editor window. So this is like another session. Okay, now let's say I'm inserting a value into test2 table. So insert into test2 values. I'm going to say maybe ZZZ. And let's take the same query and go to user 2's window. Okay, so now it's like this is one session and this is another session. Okay, now let's say select ident underscore current function, and look at this function expects a table name. The IntelliSense shows that you need to pass in the table name parameter here. So let's pass the table name, which is nothing but test2. Alright, so let's execute this query. So insert into test2, okay, and we are executing that in user1's connection. So execute that. Let's go to user2 session and execute this one. Okay, and within user1 session I am running this ident underscore current, all these statements. Okay, let's run them and then we'll understand. Okay, so scope identity, ettet identity. Now look at this, both of them are returning number 2 because they operate only within the current session. They don't consider the other sessions. But whereas ident underscore current function, okay, it operates across any session but for that test2 table. So if you look at test2 table, it should have got 3 records now, and the last record was inserted by this user2 session, okay, which is 3. The identity column value is 3. So your ident underscore current function returns the last generated identity column value for that table across any session and any scope. Whereas ettet identity returns the last generated identity value within the same session, that means within the same connection, but across any scope. But whereas scope identity returns the last generated identity column value within the same session and within the same scope. Okay, most of the times in reality we use scope underscore identity function to retrieve the last generated identity value so that we can return that back to the user. For example, if you have an application where maybe a customer is registering with your company or with your product, you need to give him a product ID. Okay, so as soon as they register and the record is inserted into the table, we need to select the record that has just been inserted, the identity column value for that record, and then return it back to the application so it can be displayed on that web page and the user will know, okay, this is my customer number. Okay, so usually in order to retrieve the last generated identity column, we use scope underscore identity function, but there are other options as well available, and we have seen the differences between them in this session. On this slide you can find the resources for ASP.NET and C# interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.